Hello, my name is Empiter, and for this video I wanted to change my perspective and tell you about the most important things you need to know when fighting against EtherTechs. Also, every EtherTech player needs to know about these things, so it should be interesting for both sides. And I will put quite a lot of information into this, so feel free to pause the video when needed. First of all the damage skills and all the debuffs of an EtherTech are physical skills with magical damage. So you can prevent them with melee bind, you can resist them with magic resistance, and you can lower the damage with magic suppression or elemental resistances. And even this rapid rush teleport skill will be prevented by melee bind and not by silence. All of the buffs, on the other hand, can't get used while being silenced. This includes all shields, the instant heal rapid recharge, the 10-minute cooldown skill escape exit, and call mech to even get into the EtherTech. Silence prevents all of them. There is also one design feature of this class that you might want to keep in mind. Most of the big hits can't get used on the move, except the cannon shot riposte and the burning cannon shot with the Gatling gun chain skills. These also happen to be the ranged hits, so in general the EtherTech is quite good at continuously alternating between ranged combat and melee combat. But it also needs this alternation, because it neither mastered the ranged combat nor the melee combat. So for all ranged classes kiting is king, and of course Chanters also need a good amount of kiting to keep these heals going. Assassins need to do some kiting to avoid certain buffs of an EtherTech, but at least they can negate the burning cannon shot chain with one evade. Gladiators, on the other hand, can try to force the EtherTech into pure melee combat, where they have an advantage in damage and of course the random knockdowns. But of course you should also know about the buffs and debuffs of an EtherTech, and therefore I will explain all of them, and you should think about the way it affects your class, and if it is dangerous, you should try to memorize the symbol. But first of all, I want to go through a few key skills. So in combination with the buffs and debuffs later on, you will have a solid overview. You probably already know that you should avoid getting hit by an Idiom Fist. And if its animation doesn't already make clear that this is a key skill of the class, the high damage on low cooldown surely does. It's a chargeable single target damage skill with 8 meters range. And especially after a stun, knockdown or silence root, it can get charged to level 3 most of the time. Normal hits are not enough to interrupt the charge up. But against physical classes, it still can be quite risky for the EtherTech to go for charge up level 3. For example, against gladiators, the route might already be quite difficult to get through. And if the EtherTech is not on 8 meters max range, it can get reached by extended weapons. So a knockdown or melee bind will interrupt the skill. Rangers might also get a knockback, and Templars might be ready to pull. Against melee classes, it often gets used without preparation on charge up level 2 though. Another key skill is Cleave Armor, which dispels most of the shields in the game. Please keep in mind that the dispel rules got changed with 4.8 and a few more shields can get removed now. The EtherTech's instant heal restores 4000 health and 6000 mana. So together with an Abyss potion and a serum, the EtherTech can restore 10,000 health points. In case this is not enough, the EtherTech might use escape exit to leave the mech. This also removes all EtherTech buffs and leaves the player quite vulnerable. But the 100% heal and removal of all debuffs can be a game changer. One special thing about the escape exit is that it deals a fixed amount of 3000 damage that can't get resisted. Another important skill is Rapid Rush. With a cooldown of 30 seconds, it is a key skill for the Ethertech's mobility, since it does 2 15 meters teleports. And as I already mentioned, this skill will get prevented by melee bind and not by silence. Also, this can't get used while being immobilized. The last special skill I want to mention is Surge of Glory, which restores 2000 mana. And it can get followed by another mana recovery or an AoE life leech. This life leech is very effective against weak PvE mobs and can lead to high amounts of heal. Against single players it is not very useful though. So in general, be aware if there's a group of weak mobs nearby. And spirits and energies from clerics can be good targets for life leeches too. So let's continue with the debuffs. Weakening Sting is a debuff that has a cooldown of only 5 seconds and it stays active for 10 seconds. It mainly reduces the target's attack speed while also reducing the magic accuracy by 300. And its only real disadvantage is that it is a chain skill of bludgeon and the Ethertech needs to go through bow skill animations in melee combat while doing very little damage. Weakening Sting especially affects melee classes, but a main purpose of this also can be to bury Silence Root. Another debuff that is often used as cover for Silence Root is Collapsing Smash. It will reduce the physical defense and magic suppression by 500, and the Ethertech will try to place this before doing the big hits. A quite strong debuff is Lifeline Slash, which reduces physical attack and magic boost, especially if you are dependent on attack speed, and Weakening Sting is also up. This is one of the reasons why it might appear that you do hardly any damage to an Ethertech, and it's fair to say that many Ethertechs will use this combination of debuffs as some kind of offensive defense.
Move closer to your target.
Cooling Wave reduces the movement speed for 3 seconds, and most of the time this is just a small annoyance, even though 3 seconds can be quite a long time sometimes. But the Ethertech will use this to gain some kind of movement advantage, and in most cases you can't really do much about it. Usually this debuff is too short to actively bury Silence Root, but for example against Zorks or Shanters that have a single dispel on a long cooldown, these 3 seconds are actually enough to protect 2 other debuffs from the dispel until the silence gets applied, which also prevents the self-dispel now. To handle these situations correctly, practice is king. So let's have a look at the Silence Root skills. This combination of debuffs can decide about the outcome of a duel, because usually Silence Root is followed by some devastating hits that can't be used on the move. And just for the record, the description of Electric Snare says that it paralyzes the target for 5 seconds, and this is a translation error, because actually it just gives you a 5 seconds root or snare, so it keeps you from walking, but not from using skills and so on. The impression of being paralyzed gets generated by the combination of silence and root, while staying out of range for most physical classes. So still you want to avoid being trapped by it, and there are several ways to do so. Of course you need some training to do it, but a buried silence root requires at least 4 debuffs. 2 debuffs as cover, and the actual silence and root. And since the Ethertech doesn't have too many different debuffs for burying the silence root, it might be enough to just prevent one of these 4 debuffs, in most cases. For example, some classes can use a self-dispel before the silence gets used. This is the most obvious way. Or if the Ethertech used an attack speed slow, to bury the silence root, you might have a skill that restores your attack speed to get rid of that debuff again. And if the other tech does not recognize this and continues with the silence root, you can then use a healing potion to get rid of the silence first, and then use a skill that lifts the movement restriction. Of course, you could also avoid the buried silence root by placing an evade skill at the right time to resist a magical hit, for example the silence, or one of the cover skills before. Or you can just teleport or blink out of range at the right time, or similar to that pre-buff movement speed and run away. Or some classes can pre-buff the resistance against movement restricting states to avoid the root at the end that way. You might also place a sneaky melee bind, or activate defensive buffs and just take the damage. Lots of choices obviously, and most of them are all about fast reactions, so that's why it needs some practice. Ja, nee, ist klar. Was ist das für eine Scheiße? Ganz ehrlich. The other tech might have a second root with a cooldown of 1 minute, which directly breaks on new damage, and even though the skill has some use for chargeable skills or escaping, for example, it comes from a blue stigma, so you don't see that too often. There are just some other good choices for those stigma slots as well. Alright, since this video is already getting quite long, I will make a cut here and continue in another video where I talk about EtherTech buffs and about some other things that didn't make it into this video. And if you want to show me that you like to see more explanatory Ion videos, then just give them a thumbs up. It's just one click. However, auf Wiedersehen. Also,